Hi, this is Sean Hafer, and in this tutorial, we're going to be using Adobe Dimension, Adobe Illustrator, and Adobe Photoshop, and we're going to map a graphic design onto all six sides of a cube using UV texture mapping. And so I'm going to start off with Adobe Dimension. Now make sure that you've updated your Adobe Dimension. I think it was in September when the most recent version came out, and that has a feature that we'll need in here called export UVs. So I'm going to just hit Adobe Dimension. If you haven't used Adobe Dimension, it's included with Creative Cloud. You can just download it. And it's a 3D visualization program. You can do some lighting, texturing, and rendering. Mainly, I think it's focused on product rendering, but it's kind of a nice little tool that you can use. With this tutorial, we're going to also then show how to share this 3D file using a web link with a built-in feature in Adobe Dimension so that you could send it to a client or to a collaborator or a professor or a teacher, right? To get feedback without having to print out and sort of create a mock-up of this object. They could still then manipulate it and sort of maneuver it in 3D space and take a look at it from all different directions without having to render a lot of different views and them having to put that together in their mind. So let's get started with that. So first off, I'm going to just create new. And Adobe Dimension, basically when we're in 3D space, we're using not just X and Y coordinates, but we're also using our Z coordinates. So if you think about it, we're going to have the Cartesian coordinate system. Think way back to geometry, right? You've got X is sort of your horizontal back and forth. Y would be your up and down, like if we're looking at a piece of paper, right? X and Y. And then Z will be our depth. And that would be sort of our dimension forward and back in space. So what I'm going to do here is I've got it open. We're in our design tab up here. I'm going to hit my selection tool, and just like Illustrator or Photoshop, you can use the shortcut V. And I'm just going to come to this basic shapes and hit cube, right? Simplest of the shapes here, we've got a cube, which is made out of 6 sides. When we're talking about 3D rendering, you might hear these called faces. You might hear polygons, depending how it's built. So that's kind of where we're at right here. So what we want to do is we're going to export a UV map. So if we've got XYZ, which says where things are in space, we've got UVW, which shows where textures are in space, or where texture maps are in space. So I'm not going to get too detailed into it, but just when you hear those terms, UV or UVWs, it's not ultraviolet light. You don't need sunscreen, but you just need to know that that is about texture space in a 3D world, right? So once we have this cube here, we can select it. And you can see here with this little gizmo shows up if you used After Effects. It's very similar to the 3D gizmo in After Effects. So you can see here, move Z. I can move it forward and back on my Z dimension. I can move it up and down, right? I can move it left and right on the X. And you can see over here, all of this is also shown here. So if I wanted to reset this, I could just say 0, 0. I'm just clicking through, and 0. And now it's back to centered. All right. And our dimensions here, this is by default 20 centimeters by 20 centimeters by 20 centimeters. If you wanted to turn on a bevel to sort of catch that light, you can see down here, I just click that little switch. We can turn on a radius, get a really rounded cube, all that. You can see how the light's hitting it. But in this case, we're not going to do that. For realism, you might want to do that, but we're going to keep this simple on this tutorial, and maybe we'll do some more later down the line. Okay, so once I'm here, I know I want to map this cube with some artwork I already have. So I'm going to come up here to my Object, Export UVs. Click that. It's going to say, where do you want to save it and what size do you want it to be? For this case, 2048 by 2048 is great. The one thing you want to make sure of is if you go too small, if you zoom in on that or you render it out, and rendering is basically going from the 3D world into a 2D image, right? So it's like kind of like developing a photo. You set up your lights and you set up your objects where that you want them in space. Then you might add materials, backgrounds, all of that. And then you go ahead and you hit render. And that then calculates all of that and renders out to the size you want it to be. So you might need it for a small 200 by 200 for an icon at 72 dpi on a website, or you might need something that's 24 by 36 inches at 300 dpi to print a poster. And so that output resolution is where you want to make sure that your texture maps are big enough for that resolution. And that's all I'll say about it here. But for our case here, we'll be definitely safe with a 2048 by 2048. And we will go ahead and I'll just save it to my desktop there. And I'm going to hit export. And it will export out. And now if I hide this here up on my desktop, Cube UV PSD, let's just double click that. Boom. And it opens up inside of Photoshop. So now inside of Photoshop here, we can see it automatically, since it's an Adobe product, it worked really great. It set up all of our information here in layers. So we've got our outlines. Boom. All right. That's where our 6 faces are. So just think about it unfolding that box, right? It just unfolded it. These are all of our edges. And if we folded this up, we would get our box again. So we've got our outlines. It's got this non-editable area. Now what that is, anything you have outside in that realm won't get mapped to the cube. So if you had a note out here, or something for a client, hey, I changed this, what do you think? Note to yourself, none of that will map onto the cube. Only the area inside that lines up with those 6 faces of the cube. Texture grid, this is to prevent stretching. So a lot of times if you've got something that is more organic shaped, like maybe a shampoo bottle is a good example, and you don't want your textures to be stretched. So this is where you would line up, you could test this to see how that is stretching, and then that'll allow you to adjust UVs, usually in another program. I don't think Adobe Dimensions has that much ability to do that at a high level, but it is just, if you see this sometimes, this is often what will be used for that task. Then our model overlay, that is basically just showing us the actual polygons. So they're triangles coming out of Adobe Dimension. So basically this is 12 polygon object. They're triangles, and 2 triangles make up each face. All right. And then we've got this little your art here. So this is where we can bring our art in. So I'm going to go ahead and open up Illustrator. And I've already got this artwork that was provided to me. It's student work from Professor Puhala. And I am going to go ahead and select just this artwork that we need. We can see on here it's got tabs. So if this was made out of paper, if you printed this out, you could cut out those tabs and then obviously glue this together and have a nice model that you could hand to someone and let them check out. Well, in our case right now with social distance learning, we're going to try and find a better way to do this. So we'll see how this works out. So got this. Go ahead and just copy it, Command C or Control C on a Windows machine. And I've got it copied. All right, and so now here in Photoshop, I'm just going to paste it in. I'm going to paste it as a smart object. Hit OK. And now I can rotate this around, snap it down here, and then stretch it out. And if our file is in good shape, we should be good. And we can go ahead and hit enter and lock that in. All right. So maybe here, looks like I've got a little edge here that I didn't go in. So let me zoom in and look at that. So I'm going to go ahead and transform that. And let's drag this out. See where we're at to the edge. And that might be better. Okay. Well, that looks pretty good. All right. So hit enter. Doot. Now we're to the edge. All right. Now if I zoom back out of here, I'm just holding down Option and using my scroll wheel. That looks good. I'm going to go ahead and just drag it down into your art here just for organization. And now we're just going to go ahead and export this out as a PNG. So I'm going to go to File, hit my old Save As here, and let's go ahead and save this as a PNG. And I'll save to the desktop as well. And we'll just go ahead and do cube map. And that should work. All right, I'm going to go ahead and save it. Smallest is perfect. Great, so that's saved. So now what I'm going to do is go ahead and head back to Adobe Dimension. All right, we can see on my desktop here, my cube map is right there. So let's open up Dimension again. We've still got it open. Now there's a couple things we have to do to make sure everything is working okay. Now, by default here, there is a ground plane on our object here. We also, there's default lighting set up. So if I come up in here right now, we can see in the scene, I've got an environment. And inside that environment, there's some options, background. So I'm going to go ahead to my background and click on this. And let's go for maybe a, closer to a 50% gray. Since we know our artwork is all black and white, this will give us a nice little bit of contrast. So I'm going to go to like around a 50% gray. That looks great. Global lighting is, what's happening here is global lighting is the light is being created from an HDR image. So if I come up here, we've got global lighting on. Now you could turn this off. We can see it turn black, and you could start putting in your own lights. So that's one way to do this. But with global lighting, what we're doing, if we come up here and click on our environment light, you can see it's using this image, which is an HDR image, a high dynamic range image, to actually create the lighting. So, this is like a softbox. This is like maybe a round softbox here. We've got the ceiling, or maybe it's an overhead big flood or a big softbox. And then we've got a sort of grayish floor. So all of these things, if this was a reflective sphere, you would see this wrapped around. And basically this is just a spherical map, or, that's wrapped around our scene. So we're getting a lot of light from these two objects and from our ceiling, but we're not getting as much light coming from the bottom. So I'll go ahead and we'll leave that. That's fine. And then the other thing we want to look at is our actual cube. So we go back to our cube, and here's where we want to map our PNG to. So I'm going to go ahead, and the thing you want to do first, though, to use UV coordinates, we need to convert to standard model. So by default, in most 3D programs, when you first create something like a cube or a sphere or a cone, any of what they call primitive objects, they are parametric, which means they're being created by math. They're not actually broken down into this is 2 polygons, this is 2 triangle polygons, etc. Right now, it's just looking at this saying, this cube is based off of length times width times height. And right now that's 20 by 20 by 20. And what's nice about that is with things like a cone, or if we had beveled edges, all of those things can be updated on the fly. It's kind of like being vector versus being made out of pixels or being bitmap. So what you could do while it's parametric is do a lot of little adjustments and things that are non-destructive, sort of like when you're using a vector scale. But if you save that out as a JPEG and you scale that same thing up, you're going to start seeing pixels and it's going to rasterize, right? So this is sort of the same thing here. So if we needed to make it larger or add bevels and things like that, that's where we could do it. But in our case, we don't need any bevels, but we do need it to be standard to be able to UV map it. So I'm going to go ahead and click that. And now we can see here that same spot, we've got place graphic on model. So I want to do that, click that. Let's grab our PNG, our cube map. There it is, all set up. Hit open, and it'll come in. It'll be in a weird spot. So I could have, just so you know, so this gray is all there. I could have turned that layer off and we would have had transparency with saving it as a PNG. But by default, you can see this is as decal. And so what that is, this is basically just kind of a sticker at this point. But we don't want that. We want it to actually wrap around. So I'm going to undo. And I'm going to go ahead, like this guy here, on that graphic. Instead of decal, I want to make it fill. And now you can see it stretches it out to the limits of those polygons and uses that UV since we set it up to make it work. So now if we click in here, we can go over here and click this orbit tool. Now we can go ahead and look how it looks. Now, you can see we're getting some glossiness, we're getting some reflectivity. Now, depending on if you want that or not, that's up to you. Now, the problem that's happening here is because of this materiality, because of this light setup, we're getting this, this is black and white, but getting it to become a lot more gray. The same thing happens all the time. Like when I used to do a lot of architectural 3D renderings, the client would almost always say, why isn't the ceiling white? The ceiling should be white, because it's maybe a 20% gray or something like that, because there's no lights shining on the ceiling. And if you look up at your ceiling right now, you're probably going to see it's some shade of gray unless you've got a light directly on it, right? So that's where 3D, that realism sometimes comes back to bite you in the butt a little bit on the actual sort of the value, right, of your colors or of your blacks and whites and how you can get that going. So there's a way we can kind of fix this here. And I'm going to come in and go to my graphic and we can check here and see what's going on. One thing we could do is if we bring up the roughness, we won't get as much of that reflection of the light area. Okay, so that's one thing we can do here, but we still have some grays, so that's okay. And what I did again, I'm on my graphic. I just brought that roughness up to 100%. So we can come up here and click on this button here, and this will give us a preview render. Now it's very rough, but what this is showing us is that we have a 1/4 resolution, and this is sort of what we're getting. Now we could crank that up to half, right? And it's going to take a little longer to redraw this every time. So if I come around, you'll see now it sits and does its thing. Now we can start to see a little bit of that shadow down here, right? Or a little bit of that happening. So what I'm going to do is click that off. I don't need that. And I can also come over. But if I bring my roughness up on the graphic, bring that roughness up, now we're at least getting no reflection from that sort of 3D world that's that HDR image. But another thing we do is come back to our default material, and there's a glow down here. And I could go ahead and bring that up to get my whites to pop. So we're kind of faking it out, right? But for this, I think it's totally fine. I don't think we need to do it. We could try our roughness here. You can see it changes a little bit. That would be if anywhere isn't covered by that decal, but I'll bring that up as well. And that probably will get us in a good spot. So what I can do now, let's take a look at what this looks like before we export it. So if we come over here, there's our design tab. We can go to the render tab. And what this will do is create a rendered view of our object. So I could come in here and let's name it test render. And we'll do low fast so it goes quickly. And we're on local. Now they do have a cloud system in beta, which if you've got a slower machine, because rendering takes a lot of resources on your computer and it can take a lot of time depending on what the materials are made of, a lot of reflection, glass, transparency, all of that. So they've got this new cloud beta they're working on that will let you use Adobe's machines to speed up your render, right, up in the cloud, so your machine can kind of, it can be faster than your machine. But it will cost money, but we'll just do the local here. And I will go to a PSD, that's fine. And I just click render. So now it'll say test render estimating. All right, and now we can see it rendered this out. We've got a little floor here. You know, we still have our floor plane on. And there it is, it's finished. So it's got a little bit of contact shadow, and that's great. So if you needed some views of it that you wanted to send to people, now if we go to my desktop, we can see we've got that test render right there. Boom, there it is. All right, so let me pull Dimension up one more time, and this is kind of the meat of what we were going for here though. Let me go back to my design view, and I'm going to come into my cube, click back into my scene here so we can see our environment. And what I want to do is turn off my ground plane. So I'm just going to turn that off. So now it's just in space. And all I want to do is go up here and click this little guy up here, share 3D scenes. And here's where you could do a snapshot as a ping, but we want to do publish 3D scene. And I'm going to call it textured cube. And I'll create a public link. Okay, we've got our background. We could change some things here before we're done as well. The ground plane, we can see that's off still. Create public link. I'll prepare it. And then it'll upload it and publish it and give you a link. So now I could come in here. I could click View on Web. And it'll open up this textured scene, and then anyone that you send this to can rotate this around. They can use their scroll wheel, zoom in, zoom out. So it's a really great way to share this information and let someone give you some feedback and send some things back. You can even come up here and create some comments. So I could say, looks great. Send it to print. And then submit it. And then I would be able to see that when I go back in and look at any of my scenes. And you can see here, if I go back, it's just all inside of your Creative Cloud files. So everything's in here. So it's a really great way to keep things organized. And you can have that you could send, put it on your website, your portfolio, that if you wanted to show some 3D some graphic things, you could have some packaging maybe you design, things like that. So it's a nice little addition built into Creative Cloud. All right, well, I hope that helped you out. You can also, render out some different views and put those in there as well. So maybe I'll do another tutorial in a little bit on getting more of a realistic render out of Dimension. I'm usually a Cinema 4D guy. I just thought this would help with some of the students and different people that are trying to find ways to share their work without being able to sort of meet in person. So hopefully this was helpful, and I'll see you in the next tutorial. Thanks so much.